Thank you, colleagues, for coming. Thank you, junior colleagues, staff, students, friends, family, Zurich community. I'm very happy to be here. The Antrittsvorlesung is a lovely tradition to which I come naive and unfamiliar. We don't have these where I come from. I gather it's a time for me to talk about what I've done, what I hope to do, but there's also a certain obligation to make some sense out of my career. I have to tell you, having almost no attention span or self-control, I mostly do whatever interests me at the time. So this is actually a pretty big challenge for me. Now, when I was invited to give this talk several months ago, I dealt with this challenge by giving a super vague title, and I figured I'll just make something up at the time, and now that bill has come due. These are scenes from my childhood. As you can see, it's lovely. There's nature, there's forests, there's animals, there's wildlife, there's sand dunes, there's beaches. What you don't see much of is people. I didn't see very many people either, and I spent a lot of time alone growing up. But I thought a lot about people, and having spent a lot of time thinking about people, but mainly observing myself, the main thing I notice about people is that they do really weird things. Let me give you two examples. When I was about 10 years old, I should have been sleeping. Instead, I was lying in my bed, yammering out loud a personality assessment report for one of my classmates. What kind of clothes he wore, what he did at recess, how he approached his schoolwork, how he interacted with his classmates, with his teachers. I really wanted to capture the essence of this kid, like what was he really like? I have no idea at the time why this was interesting to me. My stepmother came downstairs, told me to be quiet and go to sleep. Around that time, my favorite thing to do was to play with these little toy soldiers, the kind with movable elbows and knees, but I didn't play war games with them. I would line them up for 11-on-11 football, American football games. And I had these notebooks, and I would keep detailed statistics for all the skilled players on these teams. For example, there was a fullback whose signature move was running for exactly 7 yards per carry, standard deviation of 0. I think I mentioned I had a lot of time by myself. These two anecdotes don't only foreshadow my career as a psychologist, they also capture the essence of psychology as I understand it. On the one hand, we have this sense of human beings as these rich, complicated, conflicted, interesting people. And on the other hand, we have the tools that we can measure these people and their complications with. And our ability to cover how interesting and complex human beings are with the tools that we have is quite limited at this stage. In other words, I see psychology primarily as a problem of measurement. When I was a master's student thinking about where I would go get a PhD, I read a chapter by Les Morey. He's the one on the right. And this chapter, he said, I took this personality assessment class when I was a graduate student, and I noticed two things in my class. The first thing I noticed was the idea that we could use psychological assessment tools to measure people, describe how they're different from other people, make predictions about what they might do in their lives is awesome. It's fascinating. The second thing he noticed was as he looked around at the other classmates, he was the only one that had that experience. Everyone else seemed to be super bored by the psychometrics of it all. Some of my colleagues might have seen similar looks on their students' faces at times. At that time, I was having exactly the same experience in my personality assessment class. I thought measuring people was rad. And so I went to work with him, and this was a very big stroke of luck for me for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the chance to meet and hang out with my academic sister, Simone Mbwani, who is somewhere in this room, I think, tonight. At that time, Les was on the work group to study personality disorders. In those days, everyone in the field agreed that the way that we diagnose personality disorders is invalid and not particularly helpful. But there wasn't very much agreement about what we should do instead. So a great deal of my career has been focused on this problem of how to diagnose personality disorders. Here's the model that nobody liked. It assumes that there's 10 categories of personality disorder, even though there's never been a well-conducted study showing that there's 10 different types of personality. It assumes that if you have one of these diagnoses, you probably shouldn't have any of the others, even though in practice, it's more likely if you have one diagnosis that you'll have several others as well. It assumes that everyone who's in one of these boxes should be basically the same as everyone else in the same box, even though the norm is for people to present very differently, even if they have the same diagnosis. It assumes that if you could identify the correct diagnosis, that should lead you to a valid treatment, even though evidence-based treatments have only been developed for one of these boxes, and those treatments are not specific to that diagnosis. Most insulting is it assumes that personality is only clinically relevant if it's disordered, which is something that no grandmother could possibly accept. All of these problems trace back to a common root issue, and that's the problem of structure. In chemistry, we have the periodic table of the elements, which organizes matter according to two very simple rules, right? The columns tell us how many electrons spin around the outer orbit of an atom, and the rows tell us how heavy the atom is. And based on those two rules alone, we can make extremely precise predictions about how atoms will combine, and that allows us to do all kinds of useful stuff, right? In psychiatry, we don't have anything like a periodic table of the elements. And so my colleagues and I figured, well, one of the first things we ought to do is try to figure out the structure of personality problems to the degree that we can. And me and many other people have worked on this issue, and at this point, there's a general consensus in the field around a structure of unfolding dimensions that unfold in a hierarchical fashion, where at the top you have a very broad dimension of what all personality problems have in common. The dimensions get successively narrow as you go down the hierarchy. And at the level of 5 factors, you can describe how different people with different kinds of personality problems vary from one another in terms of how many negative emotions they experience, how detached and withdrawn they are from other people, the likelihood of having psychotic symptoms, how disinhibited and impulsive they are, and how antagonistic and disagreeable they are. So that's progress, and that was an advance in the science and practice of personality diagnosis. But the big news is actually, if you do the same kind of technique with symptoms of other kinds of psychopathology, like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, substance abuse, you get the same kind of picture. You get a broad thing at the top, and then you get 5 or 6 dimensions below that, and then there's less agreement of what happens below that, but we're working on it. Likewise, if you do this with normal range, everyday behavior, personality traits, you use the same methods, you get the same picture. It doesn't matter if you're asking about personality problems, more common kinds of psychopathology, or everyday traits. It doesn't matter if you ask college students, it doesn't matter if you ask psychiatric patients or people on the street. The same variables that distinguish you from me also distinguish one diagnosis from the other. Now this turns centuries of psychiatric canon on its head, right? The assumption is that doctors are qualitatively different from the patients, and here we have evidence that no, actually the same variables that can be used to distinguish the doctors can also be used to distinguish the patients. In other words, the field is coming back to Harry Stack-Sullivan, who famously said, we're all much more simply human than otherwise. But this creates a new problem. How do you tell the doctors from the patients? How do we decide whom we should allocate psychiatric services to? Do you know how you can like a certain kind of music but not necessarily like a musician within that genre? Like, I've always liked punk rock, but I don't really go for the Misfits. Or maybe you like opera, but you think Wagner's a little bit too much. Or this can go the other way around. Like, maybe you're not into soul, but who doesn't like Aretha Franklin, right? Or this works for politicians, like maybe you're on the political left, but you admire Angela Merkel or Winston Churchill. Maybe you're on the right, but you sort of like Francois Mitterrand. This works for non-human examples too. Like, take the weather. Suppose I told you that the weather is severe. You would know that you probably don't want to go outside unless you have to. But that doesn't tell you why. That doesn't tell you how you should prepare if you had to go outside. It's the style of the weather that you would need to know for that, right? What's the pressure, what's the wind, what's the precipitation? That would tell you whether to dress up or dress down, whether to bring sunglasses or an umbrella. The same distinction is also important in psychiatric classification. These are data from a study in which we followed people with personality disorders over the course of 10 years. And we distinguished the general problems that they all have in common from specific stylistic elements, personality traits like the ones I showed you a couple slides before. The purple line is the general severity. And as you can see, as patients in this sample improved, what typically happened was their severity went down. The personality style remained more or less the same. So it wasn't the case that the introverts were becoming extroverted. They were staying introverted, but they were adapting their introversion to their lives in a way that was more effective, that made them happier and more functional. This table's from the same study, but it depicts how these variables correlate with functioning in different domains. The top row shows how the general severity dimension correlates with functioning, and you see that the correlations are quite strong and fairly consistent across different kinds of dysfunction. Below that, you can see that the stylistic elements, the trait variation, this doesn't add a whole lot of predictive validity to overall severity, and when it does, it tends to be specific. Like peculiar people have a hard time having social relationships, and withdrawn people have a hard time having fun. This distinction between severity and style has important clinical implications. Given that we know that severity tends to be less stable than style, severity is what we should be aiming for, right? Our patients aren't asking for us to change the essence of their personality. They want us to help them adapt who they are to their life and their context so that they can live better lives. Knowing that the predictive validity of severity is more general than of style helps us make different kinds of treatment allocation decisions. Right? More severe patients might need inpatient rather than outpatient therapy, for example, whereas the style of their presentation, the kinds of problems that they have, tell us whether they might do better in group or individual therapy, something more directive like psychoeducation, or something more exploratory like psychoanalysis. I'm happy to report that this distinction is now in the diagnostic manuals, in the DSM and the ICD, the manuals that we use to diagnose psychopathology. Severity defines what personality disorder is, and the level of a patient's severity is what determines whether they get a diagnosis, and their trait style articulates how that diagnosis is likely to manifest. But I have to go back to something that still nags, and it's nagged me ever since graduate school when I sharpened my teeth as both a researcher and a clinician. I guess when I was in graduate school, I sort of thought that like the research that I was doing would tell me how to measure patients, and this would tell me how to treat them. But that actually isn't true. That's not how it works. I'd often find myself sitting across from a patient who would like say something, and I felt like I had no evidence or even good heuristic models to know like how should I respond to this person, right? Turns out this was not just me. This is a field-wide problem. We have difficulties fitting the square peg of practice into the round hole of research evidence. Around this time, I read a chapter by Aaron Pincus, person on the right, a colleague of mine, who wrote about interpersonal theory. I've been lucky to study interpersonal theory with Aaron and Aidan Wright, our colleague here, and Johannes Zimmerman, who I think is also somewhere in this room tonight. Interpersonal theory provided the kind of model I thought could really connect all these things together. It provided a comprehensive theory about human behavior and how it can go wrong, why people do the weird things that they do. But it also provided a strong base of evidence supporting the concepts in that theory, a suite of measurement tools that you could use to assess your patients in ways that could provide specific heuristics about how to interact with them in a way that might be clinically useful. One of the central assumptions of interpersonal theory is that people do things for a reason. Of course, they often don't know what the reason is, or they make one up later, but conscious or not, behavior is purposeful. When people do weird things, they're trying to accomplish something that's usually pretty understandable. From this perspective, we can think of mental health issues not as diseases, but in terms of goals that are too strong, goals that are misapplied or frustrated. Understanding what people are trying to do helps me see them with greater empathy, precision, and clarity. By the way, I'm super lucky to work in a department with people like Veronica Brennstetter and Alexander Freund and their teams. These are some of the most prominent motivation researchers in the world. I'm lucky to work with them. But what goals do people have? From an interpersonal perspective, we're always trying to accomplish some combination of two things: get ahead or get along. Through agency, we can establish power and status, and this gives us a sense of self-esteem. Through communion, we can establish affiliation and attachment, and this gives us a sense of security. Of course, some people don't want to be in charge, and some people don't want to be close to each other. So any motive at the most abstract level traces back to some combination of these two things, and therefore can be plotted somewhere on this circle. For example, what do I want right now? What do I want right now in relation to you? Do I want you to admire and respect me? Do I want to show that I can do this better than any of my colleagues? Do I want you to care for me, to support me? Do I just want to get out of this without humiliating myself? The same kind of structure can also be used to capture observable behavior, so not the inner goals, but the outer expression of those goals. From an interpersonal perspective, behavior can be structured according to 2 dimensions, dominance and warmth, and therefore any behavior can be plotted somewhere on this circle. For example, a talk like this is most likely to go well if I'm somewhere around 45 degrees, gregarious and extroverted. I should take some responsibility to entertain you for the 40 minutes or so that you have to listen to me, but I should do so with some level of concern for you. The basic assumption of interpersonal theory is that our behavior is always a function of some goal in relation to some object. That's what's interpersonal about it, and it's an important difference between common models of personality and psychopathology that characterize mainstream psychology and psychiatry. These models locate mental health within an individual. In mainstream psychiatry, people have something, and interpersonal psychology, people do something. This is a flexible assumption. We can do something in relation to another person. We can do something in relation to somebody in our head, a fantasy, a memory, another aspect of ourself. The important thing is that there's a self in relation to some object. For example, I might be depressed because I've been rejected by somebody, or I might be rejected because I failed to live up to some personal standard that I have for myself. In either case, depression is not an alien abstraction that's like in me in some gene or neurotransmitter and exerts pressure on my experience. It's a function of my relational adaptivity. We know other people have mental health issues because we interact with them or we see them interact with others, and we treat people's mental health issues by having relationships with them. So from our perspective, mental health is fundamentally interpersonal, or as Harry Stack Sullivan said, personality and psychopathology is the relatively enduring pattern of recurrent interpersonal situations that characterize life. So let me give you an example of how this plays out in regular life. Suppose I told you that I had a patient with the following symptoms: paranoid perception, dysregulated affect, conflicts around wanting to be both close and distant from people at the same time, unpredictable impulsive behavior, and anger. Psychiatry, such a person might get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. But what does that mean? Like, what does that tell you about how this person lives their life? Or let me put this a different way. Suppose I told you all of the notes that Miles Davis plays in Freddie the Freeloader. What would that tell you about what the song sounds like? From an interpersonal perspective, we would make predictions about sequences or patterns of how these symptoms might play out in reliable ways. You might imagine a person who approaches interpersonal situations on guard, suspicious, looking for threats, wondering who's gonna not take care of them. This raises conflicts and motives where they want to be close to people to establish attachment, but they're also afraid of getting hurt. And this starts dysregulating affect, which comes out in the form of anger and confrontation. Now, unlike diagnostic manuals in interpersonal psychology, we also make predictions about the other person who's in the black boxes in this figure. If you go downstairs to the apéro after this and somebody acts like this to you and you're just talking to them, toasting them, and all of a sudden they're like, what are you looking at me like that for? Why are you talking to me? What do you want from me? It would freak you out. You'd get anxious. You'd be like, should I get close to this person and figure out what's going on, or I think I'm just gonna bail and go find someone else to talk to. And then your withdrawal would confirm that person's belief that they should be suspicious about other people in the first place, that they can't trust you, that you don't care about them, that they're not liked. And this pattern recurs over and over again, and it comes out in the form eventually of symptoms that we label borderline personality disorder. And we can measure these different parts of the sequence and the sequence itself using the tools that we use in our research lab and which can be applied to clinical practice. They also give us specific ideas about that situation I struggled with as a graduate student. What do I do when I'm across from another human being who expects me to do something and I'm freaking out myself? With a patient like this, you would start by thinking to yourself, okay, I can't just assume everything's going okay. They might experience me as withdrawing or doing something that they can't trust. I need to check in and figure out what's going inside of them. When the dysregulation starts to occur and anger happens, the worst thing I could do is withdraw or take a position of power. That's exactly the moment when I'm telling myself I should get out of there, but what I really need to do therapeutically is be empathic and be present. Right? So this is the kind of model that I was looking for as a graduate student, and which interpersonal theory provided me. Interpersonal theory draws our attention to how processes play out over time. Psychology has done a relatively poor job of dealing with the problem of time. mostly because it's like a lot cheaper and easier to collect data once than it is to collect data over and over again with the same people. Here again, I'm super lucky to work in a department with a number of the most prominent researchers and time in the world. I'm looking at several of them right now. One of the challenges about time is that it happens at different scales, from very long scales to short scales, and the same variable can have different properties across these different time scales. One of the things I've studied since graduate school is personality change, why and when and how people differ, not only from each other, but also from themselves. I've been lucky to do that with people like Wiebke Bleidorn, about more whom later, Amber Geltallmeyer, who's also here, people like Johannes, who I mentioned earlier, and Marie Hennecke, who I'm happy to see here tonight. This is a figure from a meta-analysis led by Wiebke showing changes in agreeableness over the life course. And what it shows is that during young adulthood, agreeableness tends to increase on average. Those increases tend to dissipate into later, and then throughout most of adulthood, on average, personality is relatively flat. So we know that personality can change, but those changes tend to be fairly slow-moving. You might have heard that there's a climate crisis going on. Given that I'm like a publicly funded scientist, I feel some obligation to do something good for society, and so my colleagues and I have been studying climate change and how individual behavior can support or hurt climate change. And one thing that we know from those studies is that people who are more agreeable tend to also have more pro-environmental attitudes and therefore are more likely to engage in behaviors that will support rather than hurt the environment. What we found that's more unique is that you find the same pattern in longitudinal data. People who increase in their agreeableness relative to others over time also tend to increase relative to others in terms of their pro-environmental attitudes. And when you find both cross-sectional and longitudinal associations, that strengthens your confidence that this is a real connection between those two variables, points to a possible causal connection, and raises the possibility of using personality change interventions to help fight the climate crisis. You can also measure behavior at briefer time scales. This figure is from a study led by Aidan Wright, in which he sampled 100 people with personality disorders over 100 days, and every day they rated their level of agreeableness. So each of these little boxes is one person who rated their agreeableness every day, and one thing that you can easily see is that some of the lines are higher than others, and that just means that some people are more agreeable on average than others. But another thing that you see is a lot of squiggles. That means that from day to day, people's agreeableness can change quite a bit, right? Now we found, perhaps not surprisingly, that people with more personality problems also tend to be less agreeable than people with fewer personality problems. Probably wouldn't also surprise you to know that people say that they're less agreeable on days that they're more stressed out, right? But what's interesting about this is that these are different variables. In other words, the variables that predict how two people differ from one another don't have to be the same as the variables that predict how one person is different than their own average, right? But you can only detect that difference if you take time into account. You can measure behavior at briefer time scales still. One of the techniques that we use often in my lab is a behavioral coding technique in which we try to capture interpersonal behavior every half second on dominance and warmth. So while two people are interacting, you produce rich time series like the one above me. This one is a picture of two psychotherapy sessions, session 8 and session 16, and it's the dominance of the therapist and the client. And what you see is that in session 8 relative to session 16, the intercepts are more different and there's less coordination. And we interpreted these changes as signs of therapeutic progress. These data were from a study led by my doctoral student, Zhaochen Luo, who was interested in ruptures. Ruptures are moments during psychotherapy where things aren't going very well, where like the client is getting angry with the therapist or they're withdrawing and disengaging from therapy. Ruptures aren't great. They predict like bad therapy process, they predict dropout. So it's important to figure out what's going on and what's driving them. She found that on average, when therapists are more cold, ruptures are more likely. Again, perhaps not super surprising. But the main thing that she found in this study actually was that these kinds of nomothetic effects, the kinds of effects where what applies to the group also applies to different dyads within the group, were actually less common than idiographic effects. So for example, when therapists were more dominant, some clients seemed to like it. They were less likely to have ruptures. Others seemed to not like it. They were more likely to have ruptures. And for others, the therapist's dominance was unrelated to ruptures. So it's not the case in this study that most of the effects can be generalized from the group level to individual cases within the group, which I think is a really important finding because most psychotherapy research, even when it's longitudinal, makes this assumption. It applies group level findings to individuals within the groups. I suspect that this is not a safe assumption, and this is one of the reasons why we've made so little progress in psychotherapy research over the last few decades, some present company accepting. For as long as I can remember, it's been obvious to me that animals, like my friend Oscar here, are people too. Mammals, fish, birds, anything with a central nervous system has attachment bonds, engages in planful behavior, has differences in personality, feels pain. They meet every reasonable criterion for personhood, and yet they're not treated that way. Oscar has it pretty good. He doesn't have a lot of freedom, but he's loved, and he seems to be relatively happy. A lot of people in his species have it worse. People in other species, cows, pigs, farmed fish, they have it a lot worse. Humans generally accept that it's okay to eat animals. In fact, this is such a common assumption that vegetarians are often asked, why don't you eat animals? Now, if you go into the history of this question, there's a lot of interesting examples from famous intellectuals. For example, Leo Tolstoy walked into a slaughterhouse late in life, was mortified, and swore off animal flesh. Like many of his moral impulses, this was passionate but a short-lived promise to himself. Franz Kafka had a lot of medical issues, apparently, but he was also keen on alternative medical solutions, one of which was vegetarian diet, which he stuck to, and eventually developed concerns about the moral welfare of animals as well. Pythagoras wasn't actually made out of stone. They had really bad cameras back then. Nowadays, he's mostly known for triangles, but at the time, he had a really well-developed and thorough philosophy of the good life. And one of the central premises of this philosophy is that eating animal flesh is bad for the soul, and so he naturally didn't. Coretta Scott King didn't eat animals because she believed, as her husband, Martin Luther King Jr., famously said, that oppression anywhere is oppression everywhere. We've been asking less famous vegetarians why they don't eat animals, and generally speaking, they give some combination of three answers. The most agentic, self-focused answer is that I do it because of my personal health. A motive that combines self-focus and focus on others is that I do it to prevent climate change, pandemic, zoonotic disease. And the most communal motive is that I do it because I don't want to hurt animals. Having measured people along these motives allows us to capture what else is different about them. For example, people who are primarily motivated by health tend to be conventional, normal in other ways. People who say that the environment is the main reason that they don't eat animals tend to be left-wing politically. And people who say it's for animal rights tend to be vegetarian or more likely vegan in a way that sticks. They tend to be the least likely to go back to eating animals later. As often as vegetarians get asked why they don't eat animals, they privately wonder why the question's not reversed. Why do you eat animals? When you ask omnivores this question, they usually give some combination of 4 answers. Interestingly, one of the answers is exactly the same as the vegetarians. They do it because they believe it's necessary for personal health. Also interesting is that both groups are mostly wrong in both directions. Vegetarian diet actually has a fairly weak relationship with personal health on average. A relatively pro-social motivation to eat animals is that it's normal. Most humans eat animals, and so a way to fit into other social groups is to do so as well. A less pro-social motivation is it's natural. Our bodies are capable of digesting animal flesh, and we should do whatever our bodies are capable of doing, regardless of its impacts. And the least pro-social motive is that it tastes nice, and that's all that matters to me. You can also classify people based on their motives for eating animals. For example, people who say that the main reason they do that is because it's natural tend to engage in other antisocial behaviors as well. People who say that it's normal tend to have right-wing political views relative to people who say that it's don't say that it's normal. People who, just like with the vegetarians, people who say that it's necessary tend to be Traditional and conventional, and people who say it's nice tend to be hedonistic and self-focused. We're currently studying how these motivations change and whether we can do anything to change them and whether changing them might have an impact on behavior and meat consumption. We're hoping ultimately to use this research to encourage a transition to plant-based diets for all of the various reasons that you already know are good reasons to eat plants. This is slow going. Progress is very slow in this area, but in this job you get used to slow progress. In addition to our research, we've also started a society with my colleagues Christophe Dont and Jared Piazza called the Psychology for Human-Animal Intergroup Relations. We have a journal in which we try to provide a platform, particularly for younger scholars who are interested in this topic, from whom progress might be more likely. If I had to answer in a single sentence what I do, I would say I try to measure people and try to figure out why they do the weird things that they do. Now in psychology, there's an axiom that anytime we measure somebody, the answer that we get is some combination of the truth about what they're really like and random error. Now what we don't tend to advertise all that much is that it's a lot more error than we would like. We had a slow start and we're underfunded relative to other sciences like chemistry and biology and astronomy. We don't have microscopes or telescopes or periodic tables yet, but we're working on it. When you apply this model to the problem of success, success is a function in part of ability, but largely of random error, which you could think of as luck. In my case, luck has outstripped ability by a very wide margin. If you'd gone back to this 10-year-old playing with those figurines in my bedroom and said, you could come to Zurich one time in your life as a vacation, I'd have thought, I must have done something really right. People in my family didn't come to Europe unless there was a war, okay? My parents are here tonight for the very first time in Europe. If you had said to me at that point that you could hang out with people like the people in the first couple of rows here, I would have been thrilled. I had never met a college professor before my first college class. I was a first-generation college student. If you'd said that I could get paid to spend time hanging out with my friends, studying interesting stuff, and trying to have a positive impact, I'd have thought I was dreaming. It's impossible. And this is before you get to my incredible kids or amazing friends, some of whom were nice enough to come tonight. The surest evidence of my luck is the chance to spend my time working and living with Wiebke. I hope to spend the next couple of decades here in Zurich trying to figure out why people do the weird stuff that they do. Nobody will be more surprised than me seeing what form that takes, and I make no promises about its impact, but I'll do the best that I can. I totally get it. Really means a lot to me that you came here tonight. I want to thank you, and I hope that you'll join me downstairs for an apéro. Thanks.